Dolores Hart, a celebrated actress of the 1950s known for her iconic roles alongside Elvis Presley, once called a serene Beverly Hills home her sanctuary. Nestled in a quiet neighborhood, the house bore an unassuming charm, its Spanish-style architecture standing as a testament to the golden age of Hollywood. Yet, after Dolores left her career and the house behind to follow her spiritual calling as a Benedictine nun, the property gained a chilling reputation. The first reports of unusual occurrences came from the couple who purchased the house in the mid-1960s. They described the home as beautiful but claimed it often felt too quiet. That stillness, however, didn't last. Late at night, they began hearing faint voices, whispers too soft to discern but persistent enough to disturb their sleep. The voices often seemed to emanate from the living room, where Dolores had once entertained her Hollywood friends. The most unsettling event happened on a quiet winter evening. As the couple sat by the fireplace, the air in the room grew heavy and cold, as if an unseen presence had entered. Then, without warning, the radio, a vintage model that hadn't been plugged in, crackled to life. An old song, one of Dolores's favorites from her acting days, played faintly before the radio went silent again. Subsequent owners reported similar incidents. A family that lived in the house during the 1980s recounted hearing footsteps on the second floor, though no one else was home. Doors would open and close on their own, often accompanied by a sudden burst of cold air. One of the children claimed to see a figure standing at the foot of their bed, a woman in a flowing dress who vanished when he screamed. In recent years, paranormal investigators have taken an interest in the property. Using sensitive equipment, they documented strange vibrations running through the walls and floors, vibrations they couldn't attribute to any mechanical source. Some recordings captured faint voices, including one that seemed to whisper, "It's not time." Those who knew Dolores Hart believed the energy in the house might stem from her deep spiritual connection to the space. Before she left Hollywood, she reportedly spent hours praying in the house, seeking clarity about her decision to leave the entertainment world. Some speculate that her prayers left a lingering energy, a kind of spiritual residue that still resonates within the home. The house remains occupied, though its current owners prefer not to comment on their experiences. Neighbors, however, often notice that the lights in the house flicker late at night, a detail they claim has been happening for decades. Whether it's a trick of faulty wiring or something more, the legacy of Dolores Hart's house endures as one of Beverly Hills' most quietly unsettling mysteries. One crisp autumn evening, a young couple renting the house decided to host a small gathering. They wanted to dispel the house's eerie reputation and fill it with laughter and life. Guests mingled in the living room, sipping wine and chatting, when one of them, a self-proclaimed skeptic of the paranormal, pointed out an odd detail. The grand mirror above the fireplace, a piece Dolores had reportedly left behind, seemed to reflect the room at an unnatural angle. No matter where one stood, the reflection always excluded certain areas, like the corner where an antique armchair sat. People began to joke about the mirror, taking turns moving around the room to test it, but the mood shifted sharply when someone claimed to see a faint shadow pass through the glass. That night, the couple agreed to cover the mirror with a sheet before going to bed. They were just beginning to drift off when the house trembled, not with the force of an earthquake, but as though something heavy had struck its foundation. The vibrations were accompanied by an eerie hum that seemed to come from every wall surrounding them. Terrified, they rushed downstairs. The mirror was uncovered, its sheet lying crumpled on the floor. The reflection was impossibly dim, as though the room on the other side was cloaked in darkness. They stared at it in silence until, with a faint creak, the antique armchair reflected in the glass began to rock back and forth. The next morning, the couple contacted a local historian, hoping to learn more about the house's past. What they uncovered added another layer to the mystery. An earlier owner, before Dolores Hart, had reportedly been a reclusive artist who claimed the house spoke to him. His unfinished journals, stored in an archive, contained cryptic entries describing living walls and a portal to forgotten things. Intrigued but frightened, the couple decided to leave the house. Before they moved out, the husband ventured into the attic to retrieve a box of belongings they'd stored there. As he reached the top of the ladder, he noticed something etched into the wooden beams. an intricate symbol, partially obscured by dust and cobwebs. When he tried to brush it clean, a low groan filled the attic, as if the house itself had taken a breath. That was the last straw. The couple left that very night, abandoning their possessions. The house now sits vacant, though neighbors claim it hasn't stayed silent. Late at night, shadows still move behind the curtained windows, and faint vibrations ripple through the ground, felt by anyone passing too close. The story of Dolores Hart's house remains incomplete, a puzzle of unanswered questions and lingering whispers that dare anyone to uncover its final truth. Months after the couple fled, the house stood eerily quiet, its windows dark and lifeless. Yet something was happening behind the heavy oak doors. A real estate agent, eager to list the property, scheduled a walkthrough with potential buyers, a retired professor and his wife, who were captivated by the home's vintage charm. The tour started without incident, the professor admiring the intricate woodwork while his wife marveled at the tiled courtyard. But as they ascended the staircase, the air grew noticeably cooler. The agent, visibly flustered, laughed nervously, blaming the old heating system. On the second floor, the professor paused in front of a small, locked door at the end of the hallway. "What's in there?" he asked. The agent hesitated. "Oh, that I'm not sure. It was sealed before the current owners bought the place. They've never opened it." The professor ran his hand over the door's surface, feeling its uneven texture. The wood wasn't aged in the same way as the rest of the house. It seemed newer, hastily installed, with deep gouges around the frame as if someone had tried, unsuccessfully, to force it open. As they descended back to the living room, the wife mentioned hearing faint music, something soft and melodic, like an old Hollywood ballad. The agent assured her there was no music playing, though the woman insisted it was coming from the direction of the locked door. Determined to learn more, the professor returned alone the next day, his curiosity overriding any hesitation. He brought a small crowbar, rationalizing his decision as a scholar's pursuit of the truth. The door resisted at first, groaning as he pried at the frame, but eventually gave way, revealing a narrow, pitch-black passage. The air inside was dense and stale, carrying an almost metallic tang. Using a flashlight, the professor cautiously stepped forward, his beam cutting through the darkness. At the end of the passage was a tiny room, no larger than a closet. Its walls were covered in yellowed photographs, snapshots of Dolores Hart in her prime, performing on set, laughing with co-stars, and praying in a chapel. But something was wrong with the images. In every photo, a shadowy figure loomed in the background, barely discernible but unmistakably there. Sometimes it appeared as a blur, other times as a dark silhouette with an almost human shape. The professor felt a sudden, overwhelming pressure in his chest, as if the air in the room were being drawn out. The flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, the shadow in one of the photos seemed to move. Panicked, the professor stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. He felt a vibration beneath his feet, a deep, rhythmic thrum that seemed to pulse with the beat of his own heart. He scrambled out of the passage and slammed the door shut, his breaths ragged. Later, when he tried to recount the experience to his wife, the words wouldn't come. Something about the room, the shadows, the vibrations, had unnerved him in a way he couldn't articulate. That night, as he lay in bed, he swore he heard faint whispers in his ear, too quiet to understand but unmistakably real. The house remains unsold. Realtors refuse to enter the property alone, and locals cross the street to avoid passing it. Yet, those who linger near the house after dark claim to feel the vibrations in the ground, accompanied by a faint hum, as if the house is alive, waiting for its next guest. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The professor, unable to shake the encounter, returned to the house one last time. This time, he brought with him an old friend, a researcher specializing in local folklore and urban legends. The friend, skeptical but intrigued, carried a small bag of equipment, a tape recorder, a thermal camera, and a journal. The two entered the house at twilight, the golden light of the setting sun casting long, distorted shadows across the living room. The professor explained everything he had seen and felt, his voice trembling slightly as they approached the sealed door. The passage behind it seemed to call to him, a magnetic pull that he couldn't resist. When they opened the door again, the small room was exactly as he had left it. The photographs on the walls seemed even older now, the faces in them less distinct. The researcher set up the tape recorder and thermal camera, positioning them to capture the entirety of the space. As the equipment hummed to life, the professor noticed something peculiar. The shadowy figure in one of the photographs seemed sharper, its outline more defined. It was no longer a blur in the background, but a humanoid shape standing just behind Dolores Hart in one of the snapshots. He pointed this out to his friend, who dismissed it as a trick of the light. Then the recorder crackled. A faint sound, almost imperceptible, emanated from the tiny speaker. It wasn't static, but something more rhythmic, like a distorted voice trying to form words. The researcher leaned closer, adjusting the volume. The sound grew louder, resolving into a single, chilling phrase. "Do not forget." The professor stepped back, his breath caught in his throat. "Forget what?" he whispered, but the voice did not respond. Instead, the vibrations began again, this time stronger and more deliberate. The floor beneath them seemed to hum with an unseen force. The thermal camera beeped, alerting them to a sudden spike in temperature. They both turned to the small screen, which showed the silhouette of a figure standing in the center of the tiny room. The figure did not move, but the air around it rippled as though heat were radiating from its form. Suddenly, the photographs on the walls began to peel away, one by one, as if pulled by invisible hands. Behind the paper, dark symbols were etched into the plaster markings neither man could identify. The symbols seemed to shimmer in the dim light, their edges glowing faintly as the vibrations grew louder. The researcher, now visibly shaken, muttered something about leaving immediately. But the professor, transfixed, stepped further into the room. He reached out to touch one of the symbols, his fingers brushing its surface, and in that instant, the entire house seemed to shudder violently. The recorder let out a high-pitched screech, and the tape stopped spinning. The shadowy figure on the thermal camera vanished, but the hum in the air grew deafening. The professor turned to his friend, his face pale and his eyes wide. "It's not the house," he said, his voice trembling. "It's her. She never left." Before they could retreat, the door to the room slammed shut, trapping them inside. In the suffocating darkness, the faint sound of a woman's voice began to echo, soft and melodic, repeating the same words over and over. "Do not forget, do not forget." And then the whispers grew louder. The whispers multiplied, layering over each other until they formed a cacophony that filled the tiny room. The professor and his friend pressed their backs against the door, pounding on it in vain as the sound seemed to seep into their very bones. The words, at first indistinct, began to merge into a single, chilling refrain. "You called me back." The professor's flashlight flickered, its weak beam casting jagged shadows that danced unnaturally across the walls. The symbols etched into the plaster began to glow brighter, their faint light pulsing in rhythm with the vibrations underfoot. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, each breath forming a misty cloud that hung heavy in the air. And then it stopped. The vibrations, the whispers, the glowing symbols, all of it ceased in an instant, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. The two men stood frozen, their ears ringing in the absence of sound. It was the researcher who first noticed it. The photographs. They were no longer scattered across the floor. Instead, they were back on the walls, but something had changed. The shadowy figure that had lurked in the background of the images was now front and center in every frame. A dark, indistinct form that seemed to twist and writhe, its edges blurred like smoke, yet undeniably human in shape. The professor stepped closer, unable to resist. One photograph in particular caught his eye, an image of Dolores Hart standing in the very room they now occupied. She was smiling, her hands clasped in prayer, but the shadow behind her was no longer just a passive observer. It was reaching for her, its elongated fingers hovering just inches from her shoulders. "Look at her eyes," the researcher whispered, his voice barely audible. The professor squinted, leaning closer to the photo. Dolores's eyes, so full of light and life in her heyday, now appeared vacant, almost hollow. And yet, within the empty orbs, he could just make out a reflection, something that didn't belong. A door. Not the one they'd entered through, but another door, unfamiliar and old, standing alone in an empty void. The professor stumbled back, his heart racing. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice cracking. Before the researcher could respond, the glowing symbols on the walls flared back to life, brighter than ever. This time they moved, their lines shifting and rearranging into a new pattern that seemed to spiral inward. The whispers returned, but now they were louder, more insistent, as though demanding attention. The symbols formed a single word. "Choose." A loud creak echoed through the room, and both men turned to see the far wall begin to split, a jagged crack tearing its way from floor to ceiling. Through the opening, a faint, flickering light emerged, accompanied by a low, rhythmic hum that seemed to resonate deep in their chests. The professor felt a pull, an invisible force drawing him toward the crack. He glanced at his friend, whose wide eyes mirrored his own terror. "We can't go in there," the researcher said, gripping his arm. "Whatever this is, it's not meant for us." But the professor couldn't look away. There was something beyond the crack, something that felt both familiar and impossibly distant. A voice, faint but distinct, rose above the hum, a woman's voice, soft and pleading. "Help me." And then, just as quickly, the crack began to close, the light fading as the walls pulled themselves back together. The professor lunged forward, but it was too late. The room was silent once more, the glowing symbols extinguished. The researcher grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the door. This time it opened easily, spilling them out into the hallway. They didn't stop running until they were outside, gasping for air under the cold night sky. But as they stood there, catching their breath, the house loomed behind them, its windows dark and lifeless. Yet, in one of those windows, a faint glow appeared, a solitary light, flickering like a candle. And from deep within the house, barely audible over the sound of the wind, came the haunting melody of a familiar ballad. It wasn't over. It had only just begun. Weeks passed, but the professor couldn't shake the pull of the house. The crack in the wall, the glowing symbols, and the whispered plea for help consumed his thoughts. He knew he should leave it all behind, but something within him refused. He had felt her Dolores, and he couldn't ignore her call. His friend, the researcher, tried to dissuade him, warning of the unknown dangers they had barely escaped. But the professor was resolute. "I need to know," he said simply. "I need to know what happened to her and why she's still there." Against his better judgment, the researcher agreed to return one final time. They prepared carefully, bringing every tool they could think of: cameras, recording devices, and even historical documents about the house that the professor had unearthed in the city archives. The night they chose was eerily still. The wind had died, and the neighborhood seemed deserted. As they approached the house, its looming silhouette against the dark sky felt almost alive, as if it were waiting for them. Inside, the air was heavier than before, the silence pressing against their ears. They made their way back to the small, sealed room, but as they approached the door, they found it already ajar. The professor hesitated. This was locked before. Someone or something opened it. Inside, the room was different. The photographs were gone, and the walls were bare, save for a single symbol etched deep into the plaster. The intricate spiral they had seen before, glowing faintly. On the floor, where the crack had appeared, lay a small silver locket. The professor picked it up carefully. It was old, tarnished, and warm to the touch. Inside was a tiny photograph of Dolores Hart. But this time, she was alone, her expression serene. Beneath the photo, an inscription read, "I will not be forgotten." The moment he closed the locket, the vibrations began again, stronger than ever. The house groaned as if it were alive, and the spiral symbol on the wall erupted with light. The crack reappeared, jagged and pulsing, but this time it widened, revealing a doorway into utter darkness. From the shadows, the faint voice of Dolores echoed, "Come please." The professor didn't hesitate. He stepped toward the opening, but his friend grabbed his arm. "Don't do this. We don't know what's in there." But the professor shook him off, his eyes locked on the doorway. "She's trapped," he said, "and I'm going to bring her back." With that, he crossed the threshold, disappearing into the darkness. The crack sealed itself behind him, leaving the researcher alone in the room, pounding on the wall and shouting his friend's name. The professor's journey through the darkness felt endless. The air was thick and cold, and faint whispers surrounded him, their words just out of reach. Finally, a dim light appeared ahead, growing brighter until he found himself in a space that defied logic, a vast, empty void filled with swirling shadows and faint echoes of laughter and music. In the center of the void stood Dolores Hart, her figure radiant yet translucent, like a ghost caught between worlds. Her eyes met his, and she smiled, a mix of relief and sorrow. "You shouldn't have come," she said softly. "I couldn't leave you here," he replied. Dolores's smile faded. "It's not me who's trapped," she said, glancing around the void. "It's the house. It feeds on memories, on pain. I tried to leave, but it wouldn't let me go. And now you—" The void trembled, and the shadows began to close in. Dolores reached out, her hand passing through his. "You have to leave before it's too late. Take the locket, it's the key. It holds my memory. Destroy it, and the house will lose its hold." The professor hesitated, the weight of the locket in his pocket suddenly unbearable. "If I destroy it, what happens to you?" Dolores's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know," she admitted, "but it's the only way to end this." Before he could respond, the shadows surged, engulfing her form. Her voice echoed one final time, "Do not forget." The professor awoke outside the house, lying on the cold ground. The locket was still in his hand, its surface warm. His friend stood over him, shaking him awake. "You disappeared for hours," the researcher exclaimed. "I thought I lost you." The professor said nothing, his eyes fixed on the locket. Without a word, he stood and walked to the edge of the property. Holding the locket high, he smashed it against a stone, shattering it into pieces. The house groaned one final time, its windows shattering as a gust of wind tore through it. The vibrations stopped, and an eerie silence settled over the property. The professor and the researcher left, neither speaking of the events again. The house, now abandoned, stands empty to this day, its once vibrant aura now dull and lifeless. But sometimes, on quiet nights, neighbors swear they hear faint whispers carried on the wind, repeating the same haunting refrain. Do not forget. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Any coincidences with real events or characters are accidental.